Lebanon, located on the eastern coast of the Mediterranean Sea, is one of the world's smallest countries, approximately 217 kilometers long by 56 wide, less than 7 times the size of Greater London. Yet its geography and landscapes are quite varied compared with the other countries of the Near East. A coastal plain never wider than 7 kilometers runs along the Mediterranean shore. Inland, the relief rises rapidly to culminate at more than 3,000 meters. Depending on the altitude and the nature of the soil, the vegetation varies widely. In the same family as pine trees, there is one tree whose reputation has spread far beyond the borders of its country, the Lebanese cedar. But the mild, humid climate is favorable to many other species as well. In Lebanon, it's rather easy to trace the course of history back, for the country is full of vestiges of the past. Starting in the 3rd millennium BC, there was one population that dominated the region, the Phoenicians. They were the first of all the great Mediterranean powers that would follow one another here, from the Romans up to the Ottomans. In 1920, Lebanon was placed under French mandate, but this rule was undermined by ancestral rivalries among the country's many communities. The country was torn by sometimes prolonged conflicts that took heavy toll in lives. A civil war that lasted from 1975 to 1990 left deep scars that are still visible today. The population is largely young, city dwellers. 1/4 of the Lebanese are under 15 and 90% live in cities. The status of women is evolving in this culture marked by Mediterranean traditions where the man is still dominant. One figure, however, does reflect the change of mentality here. 50% of college graduates are women. One can still discern in the rapidly growing cities an architectural style that blends Oriental and Western influences. The historic buildings are being carefully restored, and they make a strong contrast with the shabbily constructed dwellings of the refugee camps. The thriving housing market, fueled by funds from Lebanese living abroad, is forging ahead without much consideration for the environment. The buildings reflect the wealth of their owners and the passion of some of them for travel. Different cultures have been clashing and mixing in Lebanon for centuries. If we look at dress habits and lifestyles, there are striking differences, whether between cultures or between generations. The diversity of the press is also an indication of the cultural vitality of the country, a country whose official language is Arabic, but where English, and even more so French, for historical reasons, are also widely used. Lebanon is a multi-religious society. The constitution officially recognizes about 20 religious communities. Of course, they don't all have the same weight. The Christians and the different denominations of Islam are the most important. This makes for a rich but particularly complex cultural patchwork. Lebanon's agricultural resources make up only a small percentage of the gross domestic product and are insufficient to meet the country's needs in food. And yet the agriculture sector has certain assets. The different climatic zones allow for a wide variety of crops. The profitability is, however, hampered by the size of the farms. 80% of them are of less than 1 hectare. Since ancient times, Lebanon has always exploited its riches via the coast. The country has always been at the crossroads of different cultures that, down through the millennia, have constituted an amazing treasure of life. Completely turned towards the sea, Beirut has totally changed its aspect. One could almost forget that during antiquity, the city was one of the largest ports of the Mediterranean. In its early history, the city was founded on a limestone island, the famous Pigeon Rock. On the coast northwest of the city, La Corniche is an ever-popular seaside promenade where all levels of society mingle in a lively atmosphere. As we head towards the center of the city, the old buildings become more scarce. There are many architectural ruins still buried beneath the ground. Often, they are unearthed during construction of new buildings. Near Martyrs Square, with its impressive statue riddled with bullet holes, new land is being reclaimed from the sea. Certain buildings emerge from the past as if by a miracle. They recall the splendor of the city, its legendary prosperity, and above all, the eclecticism of its architecture. They're putting a lot of effort into rebuilding the city, but they're also working to save what can be saved. This is the case with the Dome, a former cinema built in the 1960s. They couldn't bring themselves to demolish the building, so it became the Dome City Center, a very active venue for cultural events. One tries to forget the ravages of war, while at the same time honoring the memory of the victims. It's the treasure of life that the Lebanese take great pains to preserve. In the midst of all the hustle and bustle of the city, the American University of Beirut is a veritable oasis, cool and peaceful. The campus covers 28 hectares right in the middle of the town. Founded in the middle of the 19th century by Syrian and American missionaries, it is one of the foremost universities of the Middle East. Classes are held in English and are open to all, regardless of nationality or culture. Lebanon is seeking to get back to traditional values, like this organic food market they've set up in the center of town. Kamel Mouzawak.
El Tayeb Souk is a farmer's market. All the vendors are themselves producers. It's a way of perpetuating Lebanon's traditions with food, the country's typical produce, recipes.
It is, in fact, a healthy back-to-the-roots movement.
We're trying to revive the traditions of our parents and grandparents, and we offer all the good, wholesome products of the earth.
The methods of producing and preserving the food are totally natural. The grenadine juice is freshly squeezed in front of the customer. All the flavors and aromas of Lebanese cuisine waft through the air of the market. A few basil leaves, tomatoes, a slice of cheese. Wrap it all up in a pancake, and there you have lunch. Practicing Muslims fast during the month of Ramadan, the 9th month of the lunar calendar. Ramadan begins with the new crescent moon. Along the Corniche, fishermen are catching the evening meal, the iftar, for they break their fast after sundown. South of the capital, the country, bordered by Syria and the sea, gradually narrows. The highest zone of the region is the Shuf Mountains. The southern part of Beirut is a stronghold of Shiite Muslims. Shiism is one of the branches of Islam. Its color, green, is present everywhere here. Time to head for Saida, Lebanon's third largest city. The Lebanese have managed to grow banana trees here, a tropical species that needs rich, constantly humid soil. 40 kilometers from Beirut, we catch sight of the first buildings of Saida, a very ancient city mentioned in the Bible under the name of Sidon. This Phoenician port city already had contacts with Egypt as far back as the 15th century BC. The gestures of the fishermen, repeated tirelessly, have been handed down unchanged through the ages. In the 15th century AD, Saida flourished commercially when it became the port city of Damascus, the capital of Syria. The souks were surely much more active back at that time. This city has carried the Arabic name of Saida since the 7th century, and references to the past are part of everyday life here. The glass blowers of Sidon, for example, were already known for the quality of their work during Roman times. Pottery techniques haven't changed for centuries. Without a model, without a template, the craftsman gives form to the mass of clay on his wheel. The earliest traces of pottery in Lebanon go back to the 5th millennium BC. Many archaeological digs throughout the country are yielding up information through the pottery objects and shards being discovered. In the Caravanserai, the animals and the merchandise were kept on the ground floor. French merchants often occupied the upper floor, so it was called the Khan el-Franch, the Caravanserai of the French. It is now a cultural center. Saida was a strategic prize and so often had to defend itself. That was the function of the sea castle constructed by the Crusaders in the 13th century. Sections of ancient columns were used to reinforce the fortress walls. The castle has suffered a lot of damage since the Crusaders left. The Phoenicians left Sidon to establish a new port further south. It would become the city of Tyre, another great city of antiquity. The Phoenician colonists set out from here to found Carthage, the arch-enemy of Rome. 8 centuries later, the Romans landed at Tyre in triumph. They erected so many columns in the city that even today one comes across them just about everywhere. Tyre was the capital of a Roman province. A line of buildings was connected directly to the sea by an elegant avenue bordered by Corinthian columns. Here you had the Roman baths. Its floor was raised on bricks to allow steam to circulate underneath. The archaeological site of Almina is very well preserved. Between the city and the sea stretches the vast necropolis. Several dozen stone sarcophagi go back to Roman and Byzantine times. It was the Byzantines who laid out this marble avenue lined up with a Roman arch. Nearby, the vast ruins of the Roman Hippodrome, scene of the famous chariot races. This is one of the largest and best conserved of the entire ancient Roman Empire. A few dozen kilometers from Tyre is the village of Kana. We see Christ and his disciples sculpted into the rock by the early Christians. Some think that Kana is the village where Jesus performed his first public miracle. At a wedding feast, he changed water into wine. And Christ is said to have hidden in a nearby cave along with his apostles to escape persecution. The Mount Lebanon Range, or Western Mountain Range, forms the country's spine, which ends in the south with the Shuf Mountains. The town of Deir el-Kamar is the gateway to this region. Behind the Midan, the public square, stands Emir Betadine Palace, built in the 17th century. The costumes of these young women recall the fashion of that period and are a reminder that silk made the fortune of this region. The strains of a hymn in Arabic ring out from the Maronite church, Our Lady of the Hill. The Maronites are Lebanon's largest group of Christians. The Betadine Palace, designed by Italian architects, is wonderfully integrated into its environment. The palace now belongs to the presidency, but the public can visit it. The sumptuous building was built at the end of the 18th century for Emir Bashir, a governor of Lebanon under the Ottoman Empire. The interior is a brilliant demonstration of the skill of Lebanese craftsmen. All the different materials are worked with total mastery and incredible attention to detail. Glass, ceramics, wood, marble. Up above the clouds at close to 2,000 meters is the Beirut cedar forest. Lebanese cedars were used in the construction of the first temple of Jerusalem. The north of the country is dominated by Mount Lebanon, the highest peak in the Middle East. To the east of the range, the fertile Beirut Valley. To the west, the coastal plain stretching from Beirut to Tripoli. North of Beirut, on the coast near Jounieh, there are ancient stelae fixed in the rock. Erosion has all but erased the most ancient inscriptions. They are commemorations of the armies that made the difficult crossing of the mountains in this place. These stelae also mark the symbolic border between the Orient and the Occident. The best way to get an overall view of Jounieh and its vast harbour is to take to the air. The téléphérique, a suspended cable car, takes the visitors up to Harissa, where you get an impressive bird's-eye view of this ever-growing city. A ride in a funicular railway completes the ascent. We're nearly 600 meters up. Lebanese of all religious groups gather here to venerate Our Lady of Lebanon. In Lebanon, Christians and Muslims alike worship the Virgin Mary. About 40 kilometers north of Beirut is the town of Byblos, Jbeil in Arabic. It's one of the oldest cities in the world. The earliest traces of human habitation here date back to the 5th millennium BC. This Phoenician port was one of the most active in the Mediterranean. In the medieval section of the city, there are two buildings that date back to the 11th century, the Church of St. John and the Crusaders' Castle. The Franks constructed the fortress with stones pillaged from nearby Roman ruins. Byblos was a very powerful, influential city all through antiquity. Certain researchers push their investigations much further back in time. Here, they're extracting chunks of limestone from an abandoned quarry 800 meters above sea level. When they open the blocks, they sometimes find the imprint of fossilized fish, most of them from extinct species. Pierre is a paleontologist.
This is, in fact, the only place in the Middle East where you can find fish fossils. It's famous thanks to the well-preserved state of its fossils, which are the best in the world. Plus, there's the wide variety of species. You can find more than 20% of the world's recorded species. And then there's the age, 100 million years old, right in the middle of the dinosaur age.
These fish fossils are proof that the Mediterranean seabed was lifted when this mountain was forming. The shores of the Mediterranean here are lined with sandy beaches, mostly private. Certain owners have taken great pains to create a sumptuous and relaxing environment. Madame Edde.
Here's the beach that we've transformed into a garden of paradise, with pools, restaurants and banquet halls, with hotel rooms that are in the style of the old stone Lebanese homes. All the buildings, all the houses, are all constructed out of sandstone like the old town of Byblos.
Here they respect their heritage and follow a certain art of living. Byblos's reputation has spread far beyond the borders of Lebanon. People come from far and near to enjoy this culture at the crossroads of the Orient and the West. Further north, the coastal plain narrows down, confined between the sea and the Mount Lebanon range. And then suddenly it opens out just before arriving in Tripoli, the country's second largest city. The name Tripoli comes from the Greek and means 3 cities, for it was the center of a Phoenician confederation that brought together 3 populations of different origins. The citadel that dominates the city was erected at the beginning of the 12th century on the initiative of the Count of Toulouse, a few years after he took part in the First Crusade. Tripoli is quite different from Beirut. The capital is a cosmopolitan city. Of course, they do have some points in common, like the traffic and their clock towers. But Tripoli is a more Arab city with its characteristic architecture, an influence that is quite evident here in the jewelers' souk, Lebanon's largest active souk. The jewelers who sell gold by the gram do good business, but they don't have the monopoly on trade. Other craftsmen have been doing business here for ages, such as the soap makers. They began selling soap in Tripoli in their own souk at the end of the 15th century. The soaps, scented with herbs, fruits and spices, all have an olive oil base. The soap is stored in a very dry place in order to dry out the water used in the making. Certain trading centers have their own distinctive architecture. Nahas Basan.
Here we're in the tailor's souk, one of the largest souks in Tripoli. It has an unusual shape, like a long, closed-off street with doors on either end.
The tailor's souk has existed since the 14th century. The craftsmen here are known throughout the Middle East for the quality of their work. The Lebanese are quite fond of the water pipe, or nargile. You see them everywhere, and the technique is unchanging.
With this method, you dampen the tobacco under the faucet a bit, and then you put the charcoal on top.
The damp tobacco is kneaded into shape and glowing coals are placed on top. The smoke from the burning tobacco is drawn into a glass recipient filled with water. Then the smoke is inhaled through a long, flexible tube. As we approach the village of Rashana, the road running along the foothills of Mount Lebanon is dotted with sculptures. The work of the Bacchus brothers, Michel, Alfred and Youssef, and their fellow artists. The 3 brothers who took up sculpture in the 1960s draw their inspiration from Phoenician sculpture and Lebanon's archaeological heritage. Nabil Bacchus is also a sculptor, and he's carrying on the family tradition.
The Bacchus sculptors were the first to do modern sculpture in Lebanon. So then they invited other artists here who were also doing modern sculpture. But each artist has his own personal style.
Thanks to the initiative of the Bacchus brothers, Rashana has become an open-air art studio and a full-fledged sculpture museum. The mountain is a sculpture as well, but with totally different proportions. water tumbles down into the Bala sinkhole after having carved out several natural bridges. Fakra, set in this landscape carved out by erosion and history, is an ideal climbing spot. A Roman temple is perched at the improbable altitude of 1,750 meters. The rock is sculpted on the summits, but in the depths of the earth as well. The impressive concretions of the Jaita Grotto were formed by the calcium-rich water. Stalactites and stalagmites grow very slowly, an estimated 2 to 4 centimeters per century. The concretions take on different forms according to the movement of the water. When it runs down the wall, it forms limestone curtains. But when it falls drop by drop, it makes vertical columns. The Kardisha Valley was an inspiration to one of Lebanon's foremost artists. He was a poet, writer, sculptor and painter, Khalil Gibran. Here, in the monastery where he's buried, is a museum dedicated to him. A fitting tribute to the man whose family was too poor to send him to school and had to emigrate. The curator of the museum, Wahib Karouz.
He created a new world. He was a visionary. He plumbed the essential dimensions of the human being, and he spoke of those dimensions. Constituent dimensions, existential dimensions, physical dimensions, supra and metaphysical dimensions, all at the same time. Whether it was in his writing or in his painting, Gibran had such a powerful influence that there are now researchers who say that he was the prophet of modernity.
Above the Holy Valley at 2,000 meters, the clouds sometimes take the shape of the cedars of God. This tree owes its age-old reputation to its rot-resistant wood. The Egyptians used cedar oil to preserve the mummies. The standing trunks are sometimes used by certain artists. The French poet Lamartine, while traveling in Lebanon, declared, "The cedars know the history of the earth better than does history itself." The Mount Lebanon range blocks the incoming clouds. The range is about 30 kilometers across and high enough for downhill skiing in winter. People have been skiing in Lebanon since the 1930s. The sport was imported by the French. In the summer, the Bedouins take their flocks of sheep up to the mountain pastures. They have to round up the animals for milking. The operation is carried out with a very simple technique. They line the ewes up face to face, neck against neck, so the ewes block one another. Just waiting for the shepherd. Beyond the eastern slope of Mount Lebanon stretches the rich Bekaa Valley, which has been a breadbasket ever since ancient times. The plain has always been a strategic artery of communication between north and south. In the east, we can see the outline of the Anti-Lebanon Mountains. They form a grandiose setting for the city of Baalbek. The Great Mosque, decorated with ceramics, is proof of the Persian influence. Even the largest cut stone in the world seems insignificant compared to Baalbek's amazing archaeological site. It was first a Phoenician city, and the Romans, at the height of the empire, chose this site to construct one of the largest cities of the Near East. Only 6 columns remain of the Temple of Jupiter, but they are the tallest of the ancient world. As for the Temple of Bacchus, the god of wine, it is remarkably preserved. It's widely considered as the most richly decorated temple of the entire Roman Empire. And it's certainly appropriate that Bacchus be honored in the Bekaa Valley. The vineyards here are among the oldest in the world. When the French were here, they contributed to the diversification of the types of grapes. In the region of Zaleh, the main city of the Bekaa, several vineyards have a widespread reputation. Their history is quite surprising. Elsie Alou-Massoun.
The Chateau Xara began here with the Jesuits, who arrived in 1857 to found a monastery. They began to produce wine for their personal consumption. There's a sweet wine and a red wine.
But the wine is not the only alcoholic beverage produced in Lebanon.
The most popular alcohol here in Lebanon used to be arak, but with the new generation, all that is changing. People are starting to get to know wines, to drink them.
Wine is an up-and-coming market in Lebanon. There are 5 times as many wine growers now as there were 30 years ago. At an altitude of 1,000 meters, the Bekaa Valley has a Mediterranean climate. The farmers rotate a wide variety of crops. Tobacco is not as important a crop as it was. Now it's just a side crop to make ends meet. The yield of the farms in the Bekaa is much higher than in the rest of the country because the soil is so rich, thanks to the silt accumulated in the valley. Fruit and vegetables make up more than 80% of Lebanon's farm produce. At the Danielle Monastery, another religious establishment founded by the Jesuits, the quality control is scrupulously monitored. This model farm produces milk, in particular for the labneh, a well-known type of yogurt. The Lebanese are more and more concerned about the quality of life. Here they've created an eco-lodge, using natural resources and traditional materials from the Bekaa Valley. And the idea is working. Even the younger people are adapting to a more authentic way of life, even if they have to sacrifice a little comfort and do without electric appliances. Pierre, manager of the Eco Lodge, finds that the rural dwellings have quite a few positive features.
There are a number of positive points, but the most obvious are the thermal advantages. They're much warmer in the winter and the heating bill is reduced by half, a significant savings, particularly in these times of economic crisis. What's more, it's cooler in the summer. There's the soundproofing. One of these rooms is much quieter than one built with concrete because the sound waves, rather than bouncing off the walls, are absorbed by them. It's more pleasing aesthetically, for it blends in with the landscape since the materials all come from the immediate environment. It's earth and straw. The people here grow wheat and barley, so we use wheat and barley straw. We use the red earth of this region and the poplar trees that grow naturally here.
Beirut, a different planet. In the capital, day is drawing to a close and it promises to be a special evening. A family outing to the amusement park at the tip of the Corniche, the oldest amusement park in Lebanon. Here, all the cultures come together to have a good time. This evening, they're celebrating the Eid al-Fitr, the end of Ramadan, with the appearance of the first crescent moon. Life resumes its normal course. A night of festivities is beginning. The Lebanese live the present moment to the fullest through these celebrations. Lebanon has an incredibly rich past, but it is also rich in projects for the future. It's based on a fabulous treasure, a treasure of life.